I will kind of kick us off for everyone. So guys, my name is Schurra. I am a legal tech consultant. I have background in legal operations and I'm an attorney. I work with the Zuva team on the marketing side, and we've done some really cool stuff together. We've done, great webinars on SharePoint versus CLM. We came out with a study recently after doing research with 80 organizations about how people are managing their contracts. Do they use a CLM? Do they use, some other tool? And we found some really interesting results from that. So we are going to talk about that a little more later, but the goal of this is really to talk about something that was a sub-focus of our study recently, was contract management at the large enterprise level. Oh, wonderful. Hi, Thomas. I'm just kicking us off. Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry for the delay.
No, it's okay. Happy to have you here. So awesome. We're just kicking off here. I was just going to say, we're going to talk a little bit about our study later with the panelists, but I just want to focus on the idea of contract management at the enterprise level. Similar pains, I'm sure, as small and mid-sized companies have, but there are some unique challenges, right? Lots of departments, lots of different needs, people all over the world. So we're going to talk to these wonderful experts we've had join our panel about their experience at the large enterprise level. So why don't we kick off? You guys can introduce yourselves. Christina, do you mind starting us off?
Sure. So, hi, everyone. My name is Christina Wojcik. I'm currently a managing director at LexFusion. LexFusion is an innovation accelerator. And if that makes you curious, reach out to me. I'm happy to tell you a little bit more. But prior to joining LexFusion, I was the head of technology and innovation for the global legal department at Citibank. And part of my responsibilities was to be a participant, and I'll tell you a little bit more why I say participant in kind of the contract lifecycle management space within the organization.
Awesome. We're so happy to have you here. Thomas, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Thomas Barothy. I was about for 30 years in the financial service industry, and from 2016 till 2022, I was the chief operating officer for the legal department at UBS. So UBS is a financial service company headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland. Till 2022, as I mentioned. So I retired in 2022, and since then I became an angel investor in the legal tech space.
And sometimes we force you to do webinars with us.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us, Thomas. Okay, so the way this is going to work for our panelists and for our attendees, I'm going to ask a series of questions just to learn from the experience of our wonderful panelists here. At the end, we will save time for questions. So if you have questions that you want to ask the panelists directly, anything comes up, please pop that into the Q&A, and we will cover those at the end of the session. So thinking about your experience at both Citibank and UBS, let's get started with kind of the initial state of what you came into when you joined your roles. So Christina, I'll start with you. Describe for me kind of the state of contract ownership, contract responsibilities, general workflows. Really, what did you come into when you started at Citibank?
Well, prior to starting at Citi, I spent most of my career in the contracting space. And so I thought I had a pretty good idea of what the internal operations of a large organization look like from a contracting perspective. But once I entered the door, I realized that most of those perceptions were incorrect. I had to go through a process of understanding that the organization looked at contracts as a business document, not necessarily a legal document. Legal's role in the contracting process was much more nominal compared to what my expectations were. The ownership of the executed documents didn't necessarily and don't sit within the legal organization in terms of responsibilities. They sit within the business organization. And so I had to quickly kind of rethink how we were going to approach a digitization transformation process within the organization to ensure that we are using kind of the most modern approaches to contracting when it's a very close relationship between legal and the business to get those processes launched.
That was very interesting. Thomas, did you have a similar experience at UBS?
I think it's probably similar. So let me explain a little bit the situation. This refers to 2016. Obviously, I'm not with UBS anymore. Might have changed over the last 2 years.
Sure.
But 2016 contracts, in the end, contracts is a reflection of the underlying business. See, if you take a bank like UBS, you have 80,000 staff, you have millions of clients, 50 jurisdictions, hundreds of legal entities that the business operates, 4 very big business divisions. So extremely heterogeneous setup. There's not just one common setup when it comes to contracts, and all of that obviously was actually grown historically over many, many years. If you look at banking, obviously clients are very important, financial products are important. Clients and financial products are linked by contracts, at least on the market side. So the situation was basically that every business division, every jurisdiction where a business division worked on, even on the individual financial products, there was a different setup when it came to contracts. I was never able to figure out how many contract repositories there were. There must have been thousands, digital or non-digital. And I think what Christina mentioned was also very important, but I think people usually underestimate or not consider. Legal was not the owner of contracts. It's actually legal. Legal obviously was important because the business had to consult legal for changes on specific contracts or clauses and so on. But the contracts were actually owned by the business. That means also that the technology budgets were actually owned by the business. So in fact, the contract landscape is a reflection of the complexity of the underlying business model, and every business division basically did their own thing. They just optimized their own processes, and that's why you're then ending up with probably hundreds or thousands of different contract repositories with different technologies. And the same thing is then actually true also on the buying side, on the procurement side, probably a little bit more organized, and also our procurement department actually did a lot of spend into CLM systems or document management system or contract data management systems that was a little bit more consolidated. But again, extremely complex setup, with 10,000 of vendors, billions of services and goods being procured every year. That means you also, on that side, you're ending up with 10,000, 100,000 of contracts, and some of them extremely complex.
I'm sure. I can imagine coming into a role like that, kind of seeing the reality of what you're facing, and it must be a little bit anxiety inducing, right? That's a lot to manage and undertake. So I'm curious, business, you both said business owns the contracts. In my experience, I've worked in small and mid-sized companies where legal really is the owner. So it's a very different kind of experience. So if legal's not the owner, really, where did you see legal fitting in to the contract management process outside of, being pulled in for contract negotiations, for example? Did they influence tech buying decisions? Were they kind of brought into business discussions about contract management? How did that work exactly?
Yeah, I mean, so legal obviously did the legal obvious portions, right? Ensuring that the contracts were in line with the policies, procedure, guidelines, and legality, depending on the type of contract, depending on the type of product, depending on the type of business, right? There's a lot of depending ons. And it's a portion of that workflow in order from the initiation through the execution. It's, right in the middle of all of that. And so when I was setting up CLM demonstrations and looking at different solutions in the technical space, I always brought the legal stakeholders into the equation, because the last thing that we wanted was a disjointed workflow process. So if the initiation happened on the business side, maybe some of the initial document creation, and then depending on the situation, bring legal in. I didn't want to take the document out of the software, right? I wanted to make sure legal was comfortable with the software, was comfortable with the solution, could keep it within the pipeline, so that way we can maintain our auditability, we can maintain kind of a trail of who's looked at the document and when they've looked at the document, the changes made to the document, and then put it back into the business process for potential execution. And like Thomas said, every situation within the organization when it came to contracting was slightly different depending on that specific business needs. There may be occasions where Citi would be able to leverage their their paper for a transaction. And then there were occasions where we would have to accept third party or counterparty or our client paper. And so the rules of the game slightly change when you have to adjust. The other thing that we had to consider is the level of security needed over the type of transaction that was happening. So there are some things that could be essentially confidential, PII. There were some documents that were restricted. And so we really had to evaluate the security protocols around the type of documentation that we were looking at. So part of the tech evaluation, absolutely, legal is a stakeholder in it. You know, the kind of the other portion of your question is, when else does legal get involved? Legal gets involved, obviously, if there's a disagreement within the contract. It may be brought to the attention that there's something that might be out of line with what the agreement initially stated, or if there's some type of major business regulatory, you know, event that happens, and we have to get back into the documentation to potentially go through a repapering exercise. And Thomas alluded to and actually said that could mean hundreds of thousands of documents need to be repapered or amended or novated, or something has to happen to them. And then typically legal would get involved in that process as well. And so that's why there's a really important relationship between the business, how they store the documents, how they can get access to the documents. So that way, when a major event occurs, legal would have the curated or culled set of information to really focus their time and attention on whatever components are legally mandated. But there's also the relationship between, you know, the business trying to push business terms onto legal to make determinations. When legal goes through and says, okay, the legality of this document is there, we are within our policies or parameters, it's fine. Now there are some interesting business opportunities or questions that we need to go through. And so depending on the relationship the lawyer would have with the business stakeholder, they might be involved in that process as well. Or it might solely sit on the business stakeholder to take that potentially calculated business risk as to what they want to have in that ultimate agreement.
That makes sense. And I think it's really nice, the idea of business and legal working together like that, because if business is managing the contract, they're able to pay attention to certain obligations that are not legal specific, whereas I've seen it kind of be a struggle where legal has to push the business to pay attention to certain things in smaller organizations. Thomas, I'll direct the next question to you.
Just to quickly to add, Lily, I think this is
Please.
absolutely essential. In the end, this is a cooperation between legal and business, and the more complex contract types, obviously legal is a fully integral and important part of the overall workflow. Either, you know, get to the point that a contract is being signed, or then after signing of the contract, obviously that contract has a life after signing. So yeah, I think you cannot underestimate the importance of that cooperation. Like Christina said, because it's such a, really depends on the contract type. So where you know, in the company that I was involved in, some of the contracts were basically more or less fully automated, probably up to 99%. Like if you take a mortgage in Switzerland, it's basically a machine doing that, except if there's something really, some very specific setup. If you look at an employment contract, or a contract for a contractor coming in for 2-3 months, you know, to support the organization, that a lot of that is basically just flows more or less automatically. There's no involvement of legal.
No, that's really great to know. And I think if you're in a position where you have as many contracts as you're talking about, the number that you could be facing, the idea of legal being involved in every single one is just not feasible.
It's absolutely not feasible, right? Yes.
Right. Speaking of the total number of contracts, I'm wondering, when you came into these roles or early into these roles, was it relatively straightforward to know how many contracts the organization had? Was it difficult with all the different repositories? I mean, were you in a position where you evaluated the total number? And if so, how did that work for?
To be honest, that was actually never important for me.
Okay.
Obviously, we would have been able to count that on you know, on the number of financial products, or obviously if you look at the procurement side, and if you look at employment contracts and so on, of course you can get numbers, but fact is that's a reflection of the underlying business, whether some business lines are successful or not successful. So in that sense, the number of contracts, yeah, would have been somehow important, but what was for me much more important was kind of areas or specific legal teams where we really had pressure from the business that the contracting workflow was too slow, or that can happen, that the legal team or the business has the perception the legal team is actually slowing things down. So that's more qualitative data of how successfully a specific legal team works together with the business, and whether the business has a perception that some of the back office functions are not, providing enough support to really drive business success.
No, that makes sense. And Christina, I saw you smile, so tell me about your experience with total number of contracts.
Yeah, I love what Thomas said, because at the end of the day, it really matters to, I think, the vendors who want to service the number of contracts, right? And so, we had a repository that had 10 million documents in it, right? But those 10 million documents aren't all valued the same. So it doesn't really matter how many is in there, other than from a pricing perspective, from a storage perspective. But you do need to have that opportunity to get to those agreements when you need to get to those agreements in an efficient manner. And one of the things I think is really important, especially if you're on the technology side, is when you're working with a complex financial institution, if you come in for your sales cycle and say, do you have a problem with your buy or sell side contracts? Like, I'm going to throw you out of the room, because we have hundreds of qualified financial agreements and different contracting types that flow through that may not be related to like buy or sell side in the traditional sense. And so it's a kind of a understanding of who your client is, to ensure that you're aligning your solution to what their actual needs are and knowing their business a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can see how the total number wouldn't matter as much as the data in the contracts, or how the contracting process is working, or things like that. So let's talk about your settlement.
Just Lily, it can become important, and when you let's say when you need to do a repapering, obviously the number of contracts and the complexity of contracts gives you an indication of how much work there's going to be. If you're doing some assessments from a legal risk management perspective, you want to understand how many contracts include this and this clause, and how many are deviating from that. Then of course the numbers can become quite important, but I don't think not really in a run the bank, from a run the bank perspective, except the sizing of the complexity and the productivity of the underlying technology platform, of course, is driven by the number and the size of contracts.
Well, and I imagine, Thomas, in that kind of example, if you need to know how many of, say a certain type of contract needs repapering, that's likely saved with a specific team for a specific product in a specific repository, and can be answered more easily than saying across the organization we have 10 million contracts.
I think the bigger problems, practical problems at this point, with these kind of exercises, was first to figure out where are really the contracts. And A, where are the contracts? And B, if we believe we know where the contracts are these the correct contracts? Yes or no?
Right.
So that's kind of, in my view, that's kind of more an extraction issue to figure out, do I really see the full repositories, that everything, is this always the latest version, yes or no? Or are there some some amendments that are just living somewhere else and I need to find them first? So I think that's much more kind of practical issues, but these issues are extremely important, because if you can't really clarify that, you're never sure whether you're really starting with the full scope for that analysis, and whether that full scope represents the latest iterations of what was actually contracted with someone outside of your company. So
Sure. And Thomas, would you say that was a top priority for you in contract management in your role at UBS, to assess those repositories, or what were your top priorities, if not that?
I think we need to go back to 2016. I think, and we will talk about your research also, and I think your research shows that every company is different, every legal department is different, and obviously situations are different. So when I came in, there was a very immature technology stack, and my first focus was less on contracts. my first focus was much more on making sure that this legal department has a proper strategy, that the legal department has a proper technology strategy, that we got enough funding, because this was another issue. If you for many years don't have a proper strategy and no proper technology strategy, no one in the company is going to give you money. So we had to basically create this fundamentals first to basically earn the right to invest. So that was the first focus, and then on the technology strategy, obviously we always coordinated with the business on specific CLM solutions where the business actually paid for it. But our main focus at the beginning was first to get kind of key technology elements in place, like meta management, then a global document management system, which actually gave us access to all of the data that was actually flowing in and out of the legal department. Contract is one element. Contract is not the only data that flows in and out of a legal department. There's many other things. But we took a very deliberate decision first to make sure that we would be able to get access to all of the data that flows in and out of the global legal department. It gets manipulated by the legal department, which also then, I think, from a cultural perspective was important, because it started to create a discussion of what would actually be proper data management principles for a legal department. And our vision was then, okay, let's first get access to the data that flows in and out of a legal department in some form or the other, so that we could start to mine that and start to do extraction analytics on top of that. And then from there, from that point on, then to deepening the discussions with specific business divisions on some specific CLM, or contract lifecycle and contract workflows. But there was a deliberate decision basically to do this in 2 stages.
That makes sense. And I have questions on data that we'll talk about later, because I think it's such a crucial part, obviously, of contract management. So, Christina, what about you at Citi? What were your top contract management priorities when you started?
Really, it was not even thinking about technology to start. It was thinking about process, right? What is the current process from that initiation through execution? And then what's legal's kind of part in that process? Documenting the current process, working with the business on setting a future state process, evaluating the technology market to understand what the opportunities were to not necessarily fit with our future state process, because oftentimes I think that's a big mistake that people try, is forcing the technology to do what you think is best versus leveraging the technology to do what it was built to do. And the one thing I didn't want to do was bring on shelfware. Spent a lot of time and money sourcing a product and then just not use it because we sourced potentially the wrong thing. The other thing to consider is, as you're going through that process engineering, you have to understand a lot about data, not only the data itself, but where is it going, who's going to look at it. So if you're looking at a process and the contract might be initiated out of the UK, but then you've got lawyers reviewing it in the US, and then it has to go to Germany, right? We're talking about, 3 kind of different jurisdictions from privacy considerations, from data security perspective. So now you need to start involving other team members within the organization. So then you would start bringing in the cross-border kind of compliance team to make sure that the data is allowed to flow in that way on this type of technology. You have to bring in different internal technology teams. So if you're going to have a technology that's going to service legal in the business, which technology team within the organization is going to support this particular application? Because it's likely not going to be the team that's supporting legal technology, because as Thomas mentioned, legal technology is more traditionally thought of as the e-billing matter management systems, outside counsel management systems, spend analytics when it comes to legal spend, those types of things. So contracting is a little bit outside of that. So who's going to support that? So now you need to gather support from a sponsorship standpoint, not only from kind of the risk, compliance, technology, but then budget, right? we all know we need this, but who is responsible for paying for it? And most of the time in my situation, it was going to be the business paying for it. So then how do you build that ROI to secure that business funding for this, and determine that if you allow legal to participate in this process, we can help create that perception that we are no longer a bottleneck, right? We are an active participant in this. And then if you allow us to have a say in this process, then information and the execution or the negotiation will happen that much more quickly. So it was really important to line up all of those stakeholders going through this process, because if you're missing any one of those stakeholders, and I'm not even naming all of them that have to be involved, then you get stalled. And when you get stalled, it takes even longer. And oftentimes onboarding new technology can take 12 months to 2 years, depending on the maturity of that organization, their security infrastructure. So it's incredibly complicated to go through. So that was, long story short, my priority was to understand the stakeholders, understand current process, create future state, and then make sure everyone is aligned to a common vision of delivering on that future state.
I'll go into my next question here because that perfectly kind of transitions us. I'm just curious if you can talk to your approach to change management, specific to this kind of large enterprise context, because I think in contract management discussions, everyone talks about change management. You talked about the importance of kind of lining up the key stakeholders, keeping them informed. But really, how do you make sure that any changes that you're implementing in a large enterprise, that you're continuing to keep them informed, that you're kind of managing any pushback you're getting? Talk me through that. Christina, I'll start with you and then pass it over to Thomas.
For me, change management has to start way before there's going to be any change, right? So it's bringing those stakeholders with you on the entire journey. For 2 reasons. One, because their participation means that at the end of the journey, if they're not happy, they could have changed it at the beginning, right? So it's holding some accountability to those who are participating in the journey, that, hey, this doesn't work because Christina never asked my opinion, right? That was just never going to be something that was on the table. So starting them from the absolute day one for those particular stakeholders, and as you go through that journey of technology identification, process engineering, workflow engineering, technology, identification, RFPs, all the way through product testing, that the stakeholder is right there with you. So by the end of that journey, they've already slightly changed because they know the product that you're going to use. They're familiar with it. They're comfortable with it. They're excited to use it because they've been part of that process. I think that the biggest mistake that people make is making a selection and then trying to retroactively get people on board. And when you do that, you just have that human nature that says, well, I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. This isn't, this isn't my thing. I'm not going to cooperate as fully as, maybe I had been if I had some kind of stake in it from the beginning. So that was very important to me from a change management perspective. But also from a change management perspective, when you're evaluating technologies, you have to make sure that they're user friendly. They have a good UI, there's a good UX, because if you're trying to get people on things that are complicated or hard, then you've just made your job even harder. So really making sure that you're working with the providers to ensure that they're delivering and they're really focused on providing that really good experience. So that way, when you finally get someone who's willing to use the product on it, they have as enjoyable of experience as you could possibly have with that product.
Yeah, just to add a couple of points, I think the change management starts very much earlier before the first change is implemented. I think is extremely important. It means really, obviously, to identify all of the stakeholders and then really understanding what is actually driving them, what is really important for them. And I think that's important then also to track that. And in my view, you cannot really implement a new process or a solution which is absolutely contrary to what a key stakeholder actually wants or what is important for him or her. So that's one element. And the other thing that we used a lot was actually thinking about, can you start with a simpler pilot, or even just with a mock-up, particularly if it's a change of a process? Can you bring all the stakeholders in a room and then just walk through a mock-up how the new process would look like, and get buy-in? I think that's a simple strategy. The next thing is really trying, if possible, to implement a pilot or some form of a pilot, because a mock-up and a pilot and these type of approaches are basically creating a learning curve. And if a change is successful in a smaller environment with a smaller scope, then it's also easier to communicate this, because my experience was always when we get to a point where we had a successful pilot, it was so much easier to show this to people, and it was actually then also hands-on, not some kind of theoretical change, something that people could really experience. Or you can put it into a five-minute video and and send this to people so they could actually see how this new technology or this new process actually would really work. So I think creating something that's tangible and that takes kind of the theoretical discussion away, where people can really have an hands-on experience, that's much easier. And the interesting thing is you can always have some people which are really demonstrating extremely high buy-in, so what we would call a champion. I think champions, or if you have teams which can act as a champion, are fantastic to then fully roll out a change. Makes it so much easier.
No, absolutely. Like Christina mentioned, people getting excited about the technology goes a long way too. So having champions, it's really meaningful. I actually had someone email me once, someone on the executive leadership team of a relatively large organization sent me a screenshot of an email that said, essentially, we've purchased a new CLM, we're implementing it. You get on board or or else. And he was super concerned. He said, what does this mean? I've never heard anything about this. How does this affect my job? And you can imagine people were not thrilled. That is not the message that I think you should use, whether small, medium, or large size company. So we've talked a little bit about obviously change management, the involvement of the business stakeholders, how important it is that the kind of business manages these contracts. I want to spend a few minutes on data sharing and integration just before we dive into some thoughts on the Zuva study. So I'm curious, obviously an enterprise organization has a huge tech stack, whether that tech stack is highly sophisticated, needs improved, it doesn't matter. I'm sure they're using tons of technology. How important do you think it is for whatever contract management solution you're using at the enterprise level? I imagine there are multiple. How important is it to integrate those solutions with existing legal team tools versus tools that the business are using? Talk to me about some of those integration needs and some of the things you guys have thought through in your various roles. Christina, I'll start with you.
Honestly, not important. As long as there's good visibility into that CLM system or into the business tools, so that way we can do quick searches, quick queries, or apply machine learning over a bigger portion of the documentation, so that way we can have immediate answers if we need them. Linking it to an e-billing or matter management system, not that important, because typically our contracts don't result in a matter. We typically aren't using outside counsel. It could happen where we use them to help with the contracting process, but it's just something not that typical. And when we think about some of the reasons why the contracts and the data of the contracts oftentimes live outside of legal, is for auditing purposes. It's obligation management, which obligations are not managed necessarily by legal. Legal doesn't necessarily care if there's an auto renewal in it. That might be something that's more of a procurement thing to worry about. So that was not something that was a priority, was ensuring that we had access, visibility, or connections. Now, the only time where it could possibly have a kind of a legal connection is if we weren't doing an automated or digital transformation initiative and having it in a document repository for sharing during the negotiation process. But at the end of the day, those templates, everything really need to be living within that business application for a number of reasons. So again, not important for integration within legal technology tools from my perspective.
Thomas, what about in your experience?
Yeah, I think similar experience. So if you just look at the traditional technology stack that's being used by a legal department, not that important, or probably not even important. On the business side, it's different. Some contract types and some contract workflows, obviously they need to be highly integrated. For example, with sales applications or in a banking environment with applications that financial advisors are using as an example, or applications that might probably have an interface to clients even. So I think on that side, integration is extremely important. And integration into risk management system depends on which business divisions you're looking at. So on the business side, because obviously the bigger part of the complex of the process of a life cycle of a contract actually is on the business side. That integration was certainly extremely important. That's also why I mentioned earlier, we had, and you certainly still have some businesses where the contract flow is basically automated, and that's nothing else than, you could say, kind of the end state of full integration. STP, straight through processing, where basically no one touches a specific contract anymore or a specific document.
I'm curious, and I ask this question primarily because of my own ignorance, right? My experiences in smaller organizations. So if there was a need to understand something about a contract, in my experience, the question always came to legal, or legal was kind of the manager of all contracts, which meant that people could get all of their information there. So business teams weren't reviewing them. They weren't actively pursuing information on their own. But it sounds like in your experience, because business owned the contracts, they're the ones looking for the kind of the business specific terms, like Christina mentioned, auto renewal, things that as a lawyer, like I don't really care about. So I'm curious, in sharing data with the business, if they needed contract data, if they weren't going to review the contracts themselves for whatever reason, did that always come through kind of strategic integrations with various tech tools they were using, or did you find other ways for contract data to be shared among the organization?
Well, one example I can provide is, oftentimes there are global events that happen, and it might impact your vendor agreements because you need to start thinking about termination language, right? Force majeure provisions. And so typically what happens is there will be a major global event that might impact kind of the supply chain or something that affects your organization or one of your products or one of the lines of businesses. And so that's something that sourcing or the risk team might initially identify as a potential challenge. The risk team would then go, or risk and compliance team would then go and talk to the procurement or sourcing team, resource management team, whatever that kind of group is called, to say, hey, listen, it looks like something is happening in this area of the world. What does that mean from a contractual perspective with the vendors or suppliers or our clients in that area? So then the sourcing and procurement team would say, okay, well, let's identify who could be impacted and start narrowing down that population of hundreds of thousands of potential agreements to say, okay, this is the area that's impacted. These are the clients, the vendors, whomever might be impacted. Now we'll walk down to legal and say, hey, listen, major event, risk and compliance identified something. Here are the contracts that we pulled out of the vendor solution. Legal, what can we do about this, right? What does our force majeure provision say? What kind of early termination rights do we have? What are some alternatives we have to, potentially not terminating this contract, but what remedies are there if our providers can no longer bring us? So that's kind of the chain of events that we would see. So legal gets involved almost at that end stage and then helps create that strategy, that plan, maybe creates new templates. Maybe gets into hard conversations with those suppliers or vendors to terminate that arrangement because it's no longer suitable for either side's needs. So that's kind of how the flow works.
Okay, that makes sense. And Thomas, what about in your experience?
Yeah, it's absolutely the same. So you could say legal is then just in that sense really much more focusing on you could say on the advice part, or what you have, but very often in financial services is a change of regulation. Obviously we have seen this particularly after the financial crisis. So you need to go back into your contracts and see whether some clauses, whether they still make sense, or whether they need to whether they need to change. And so you've basically, in the best case, you've basically kind of pre-work by the business. The business, business divisions, they have their own CEO areas, as an example. They have their sales teams and so on. So they're usually quite capable, to figure that out. You could say then you get really kind of the numbers and however kind of the wording looks like, and then I think that's where then usually legal gets involved with exactly these questions. What would you, from a legal perspective, what would you advise? Sometimes it gets involved into renegotiations if it's very complex. Can happen as well. And then obviously, there are much more complicated situations when you, let's say, you do an M&A, when it comes to due diligence, and of course that's again different. So I've also seen instances where the questions were so complex that you basically need to set up kind of a small little project, which has representatives from legal from the beginning on and from the business, and then you first need to sit together and figure out what's now the best strategy to really solve this problem.
That makes complete sense. And it's interesting because, like I said, in smaller organizations, I've not seen business take such a huge role in that kind of initial work up front. It must be critical for legal teams and large enterprises because of the sheer size of the contract portfolio that they have. So I'm going to take the next few minutes, talk a little bit about our Zuva study. And I want to get your kind of thoughts and perspective based on some of the findings we found specific to large enterprises. So Thomas, you alluded to this earlier. We did this study here at Zuva. We talked to 80 different organizations around the world. Of those 80, 32 of them had over 10,000 employees. And our key learnings from those organizations were there's no kind of one size fits all approach. There's no one size fits all solution. Everybody kind of manages things in a different way. And a lot of times that comes down to just the solutions they're using, right? Every large organization we talked to was using multiple different solutions to manage their contracts, was integrating with multiple different kind of tools at their organization to help make the sharing of data and information easier. But some of the key things that I found particularly interesting in these conversations, legal didn't own the buying decision, so if it was something like a CLM, it wasn't up to them. They were oftentimes, like Christina had mentioned, brought into the conversation, but or maybe they ran the conversation, but ultimately the purchase was made by the business team. So, there were a lot of kind of cross-functional conversations and decision makers there. And if they were using, I think kind of going back to the fact that they have multiple solutions, if they were using a CLM, that use was not enterprise-wide by any means. And the biggest challenge each of these organizations mentioned to us was struggle with tracking metadata, which obviously excited us here at Zuva because that's what we do. But before I share one specific example that I found really interesting from one of our interviewees, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts based on some of those key findings? And, do those resonate with your own experiences? Christina, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. Coming in, I'm like, we're going to get an enterprise contracting solution. And then quickly, like, no, we're not. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because certain CLMs might be better integrated with ERP systems or CRM systems, or there might be other integrations that have to happen with the business technology that isn't a natural fit for certain kind of configurations of some CLMs. Some of the really new kind of sexy looking CLMs that are foundational AI tools, they're not robust enough to handle enterprise needs from a security perspective. And so my goal was to have as many tools as it potentially took, which is going to be very controversial, and we'll need more time to kind of dissect that, but have a seamless user experience. So that way, if you're coming in to request a document or to input a third-party paper or client paper, you don't know where it's going, because it just goes to the right place and feeds the right system and gets to the right people in a flawless. So the user experience would be universal, even if the technology behind that experience was not.
I think that's absolutely critical. Thomas, what about you? Does that resonate with you in your experience?
Yeah, I was really not surprised by the results, actually. But the great thing is to to read this in a report, because I still believe there's kind of too much, I don't want to call it CLM hype, but sometimes I'm getting the impression that people believe you just buy one CLM solution, that's it. I said it at the beginning, contracts, or kind of the contract landscape that you have in a company is a reflection of the complexity of the underlying business. Any company has contracts from the beginning on. So some companies are hundreds of years old. So obviously contracting was always an integral part of doing business. It has to be an integral part of doing business. So if you have a very complex business model, a very complex business setup, and a very complex global organization, then of course the contracting landscape is very complex. And then of course it's not a surprise that we have a much more heterogeneous picture when it comes to whether people are using CLM solutions, whether they're using CLM solutions enterprise-wide, or whether they're focusing on document management systems. That makes perfect sense. It's just a reflection of a individual specific strategy, which obviously tries to cope with what you actually find in a specific circumstance, in a specific company. And I said at the beginning, also in our case, we first focused on getting access to the data that flows in and out of the legal department, because the investments by the business lines into some form of CLM systems was so much faster, and they had so much bigger budgets that I would have never been able to cope and to even to catch up with that. It's just not possible from the level where the legal department actually was. So we had first, in a certain way, to catch up, get much more proliferate, much more much more sound when it comes to data management principles, and then first getting to a point where we actually were able to access the data that we manipulated each and every day. So at least that was our decision. Obviously, I think other legal departments we come to different decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say for any of our attendees listening, if you have not read our study, we'd love to have you do that. In the chat, you'll see a link to access it. We thought it was very interesting, the conversations that we had. One example interview that we had, large global enterprise had over 200 global entities, over 100 document repositories. Thomas, like you said, in the conversation I had, the woman I spoke to said, I'm not really sure how many document repositories we have, to be honest. And it was just a near impossibility to move everyone to one solution. So their strategy was to roll out SharePoint as a document management system to all the global entities, which is going to take time. They started with a test of 2 entities in the hopes of better managing repositories, using a tool that people were more comfortable with. But to Christina's point, the goal of seamless user experience, that was not kind of the be all end all. It was not going to be SharePoint and nothing else. SharePoint, along with other strategies and process and workflows to get everybody the data they needed, access to the contracts they needed, the process that would be, best for them. So please take a look at the study. Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear it. We've got 7 minutes left. I want to be really mindful of any questions the audience may have. So anyone in the audience that has questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'll give you guys about a minute to start putting those in. And if you don't have them, I've got more to ask anyway. So we'll keep the conversation going. I should have some sort of like Jeopardy clock. Is it Jeopardy that has a clock? Can't remember. I'm not a big game show person.
I wanted one point, Lily, on the example that you mentioned, which is also interesting. I think it's also in a certain way a recommendation is if some of the participants here on the call think that they need to do something in this space, look at the technology stack that you already have in-house. You don't always need to buy a dedicated CLM solution. We also, in our case, we leveraged a lot of technology that was already used by other areas of the bank, which, it's already onboarded, it's in the bank, there's a license already, someone pays for that license. So it's much easier to start to leverage this. And with SharePoint or with other existing technologies that might already be in the company, you can do already a lot of tons, when it comes to contracts.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. We found from our conversations that most people were using their chosen contract management solution or solutions as a repository primarily.
Yeah.
Just, so something like a SharePoint is a great place to do that. So, okay, while we wait to see if there are any questions, I'll ask some more. So let's say someone in the audience has limited resources to make improvements in their contract management process at a large organization. Do you think that there are, what do you recommend in terms of some high impact, low cost changes they can implement in their current process?
I think look at your templates, right? So if legal owns the templates, then you can look at your templates and try to do a template consolidation process. So that way you've got less versions and hopefully streamline some of that. But again, given that most of it will sit outside of legal, you can only look at improving what you're doing. Maybe it's creating better alternative playbooks. Maybe it is seeing, to Thomas's point, if there's a simple workflow tool that you can just use within legal, if it's a complex document or needs to go and get different types of legal review from different people, and taking that license opportunity from somewhere else in the organization. Little things like that can make a big difference, but also require a lot of effort. And it's still a lot of stakeholders to kind of move the needle.
Sure.
Just to add a very simple recommendation, talk with the business, try first to figure out where's the biggest pain point. What's hindering them to be more successful, interaction with legal on specific contract types or whatever. Because I always had several times this experience that we or our legal team had a certain view on certain pain points, and then we actually talk with the business, the pain point was substantially different. So first, putting yourself into the shoes of the business, talking with them, what's your biggest problem? Is there a way where we can solve this? Is there a way where you can actually help us to solve this, or where we can collaborate to solve this? And sometimes there can be very low technology solutions, but we're not even, often it's just more a question of better organizing a workflow, making sure that people know the status of contracts or whatever it is. So that would be always my recommendation, get out of your department and try to figure out what's the real pain point, and is there an easy way to address it.
Before we go over to these questions, I was just going to say, you're both in legal innovation in some respects, like Thomas is an investor, Christina at LexFusion. Makes me think of the question they always ask in Shark Tank. Every time somebody gives a pitch, they'll say, is this a real problem? Do people actually have this problem? How many people do? So, Thomas, your point of understanding the problem, I think, is so critical, regardless of what you're doing, whether you're implementing a process or providing a tech solution or whatever it may be. So Peter asks us, is there a problem to renew contracts according to regulation updates? So I guess based on regulatory changes, how do you manage your ability to renew contracts or, assess changes that need to be made based on those regulations?
Again, there's a kind of a complicated process to that. So our compliance team would recognize a change of law. The change of law would then flow into the business to the legal to determine what the impacts of that are. Legal would have conversations with the business if it looks like it might have a material impact on some of the contracts we have. If there's a regulatory deadline for when those changes need to be made, that's a different approach than as a go forward, all contracts need to say this, but contracts previously are grandfathered into whatever this thing might be. Unfortunately, oftentimes there is a deadline that all contracts that are related have to be changed for it, and that goes into a major regulatory repapering exercise. So there's depending on what the regulation is, depending on the potential impact, and depending on deadlines, it impacts the way you kind of address that particular change.
And just to add on Peter's question, it sounds a little bit that this is kind of straightforward, but this can be extremely complex. In the particular financial service industries had very complex regulatory changes. It's not easy to figure out which contracts are impacted and then actually to amend them.
Sure. I know we're at time. I'm just going to ask if you guys can stay on for 1 or 2 more minutes to answer these last 2 questions.
No
Okay.
problem, sure.
Okay, so why do you think, I'm going to go to Thomas first. Why do you think that CLM, which provides, they talk about providing comprehensive solutions for clients, is still not very popular, even though it can look like a must-have? You mentioned CLM hype. We use that language in our study. Why do you think it's still not very popular for a lot of businesses?
So going back to your report, in the end, it's a question of why is the percentage of companies using CLM solutions relatively low. I think, and this is in comparison mainly to a document management system. My personal experience, the implementation of a document management system, even a global document management system in a global legal department, it's so much more straightforward and easier. As it's less change. It's faster to implement. It's just a fact, A CLM, because its contract lifecycle is much more linked to an underlying workflow and obviously to an underlying contract type. So you need to fully analyze and fully understand the whole flow of this contract, which is obviously, that creates complexity. Plus, let's not forget, we haven't yet talked about this, contracts and the underlying. It's a contract because a contract is a reflection of a business process. These business processes are not static. They can change extremely fast. Business, whatever. They're starting to make changes to a product and so on, or the way how they actually selling a specific service. So you also dependent on the question of how long-term or how stable is actually the underlying business process. If we look at the document management system, all of that goes away because the document management system is just by nature just captures every document, whether it's a contract or something else or email, whatever, doesn't matter. It's in that sense, it's much more technology which is not really process, kind of influenced by specific business processes. It can then, if you're starting to build workflow solutions on top of it. But as a repository, in my view, much easier and faster to implement. It's not saying that I'm not supporting CLM systems. My point is really first try to understand what's the underlying process. What is it that you want to achieve, and then start to think about, okay, that's the current state of the process. That's the way how we want to change it. Here and here, technology makes sense, and what's actually the best technology to support this. And if you then come to the conclusion it should be a CLM system, then fine, But in my view, not the other way around.
Yeah, and I'd say that CLMs are fundamentally sound, right? 9 times out of 10, they are going to work as warranted. And the reason why they're not as readily adopted is because there's a lot more complexity that goes into the contracting process. There is a lot of process engineering that has to happen first. And there's this just tension between kind of the CLM kind of vendors or creators, the software creators, and the actual challenge you're trying to solve. So if you're trying to sell software, but the process is broken, and then you put a broken process on a software, you haven't started the change management at the very beginning, it's just going to fail. And it's going to hurt the reputation of not only that provider, because it's never the people that are broken, it's always the technology that's broken. So your tech didn't work to solve my problem. Then you get that kind of sour taste in your mouth. And the people who are trying to bring it into the organization now have an even higher mountain decline, because now they have a population of users who are like, technology doesn't work for this. And so it's really interesting to think about how we can look at CLM differently, how we can kind of break some of the stigma around, past failed implementations, how we can look at what we actually are trying to do, to Thomas's point. Are we just trying to get information out? Do we know that people are just going to negotiate the way they're going to negotiate, and no amount of change management is going to change that? So how do we reflect and create solutions based on their needs, not the perceived notion of what the ideal future state can look like? So I always say the vision of the possible and probable. CLM providers provide kind of a vision of the possible. But is it probably going to get there? No. So what can we probably get to and really focus on driving solutions around the probable?
That was wonderful. Thank you. Super helpful from both of you. I know we're over. Noah said we can skip his question. Noah's our founder and CEO, so thanks, Noah. Just wanted to say thank you to our attendees for joining, and Christina and Thomas. It's incredibly valuable to learn from you guys today. You have a ton of experience in this area, and it's very clear from our discussion. It was great to talk to you both. So thank you so much for your time.